Hey, welcome to 12 Tone. Back in the year 2000, Linkin Park was putting the finishing touches on their debut album, Hybrid Theory. After years of fighting with labels and A&R reps who couldn't see a market for their innovative genre-blending sound, they'd finally gained the creative freedom necessary to make exactly the album they wanted to make. But while everything was coming together, there was one song that was still causing friction within the band. Lead singer Chester Bennington thought it was too soft and wouldn't fit in with their heavier tracks like Crawling and One Step Closer. The rest of the band wanted to release it as a single, but Bennington didn't even want it on the album. Fortunately, he was overruled. Hybrid Theory was released to immediate acclaim, and after testing the waters with 3 other singles, they finally dropped In the End and proved him very, very wrong. Fans loved it, often screaming along so loudly at shows that the band eventually just stopped playing during the bridge and let the audience carry the tune. And it sold well too. All the singles off Hybrid Theory were certified at least gold, but In the End blew the others out of the water, going quadruple platinum and selling over 4 million copies in the US alone. Even Bennington himself eventually came around, admitting that he'd grown to like the song quite a bit, and joking that he decided to sit out of all future discussions about singles because he clearly didn't know what he was talking about. 23 years later, In the End is still Linkin Park's most iconic song, and especially in the wake of Bennington's tragic death in 2017, it's taken on a whole new kind of significance for longtime fans, myself included. Let's take it apart. The song starts like this. With Mike Shinoda alone on a piano, and when I'm analyzing such a simple riff, my favorite approach is to just start changing things and see how it breaks. For example, this is pretty much all quarter notes. There's no syncopation, no rhythmic variety to create interest, so let's add some. Okay, it's not bad, but it's clearly lost something. The slow, methodical pace of those quarter notes gave the riff a deliberate, wistful vibe, like he's carefully going through the motions of his life, and the syncopation adds a fun, bouncy edge that feels inappropriate. So great, quarter note's good, eighth note's bad. But what about this last beat? There's an eighth note there. Shinoda must have forgot that he wasn't supposed to play them, but that's okay, I'll fix it for him. And again, it's worse. So why is this eighth note good when the others were bad? Well, for starters, it's not syncopated, but more important is the melodic role it's playing. This G-flat isn't a structural note, it's an escape tone swerving away from the target note before dropping back down. It creates a much stronger landing on the next E-flat, almost like these two notes are both resolving to it at the same time. Giving the G-flat an entire beat pushes the previous F too far back, so the big arrival is significantly weaker. So okay, we'll leave the rhythm alone. But what about notes? Like this first bar is clearly arpeggiating an E-flat minor triad, so let's use a more normal arpeggio shape. Whoops, my bad. The melodic shape of the riff has a clear downward trajectory, hitting a high point and then slowly gliding back down to the root. We already saw how the escape tone at the end emphasizes the bottom of that slide, and it seems like the big immediate leap up to B flat on beat 2 is how they emphasize the top. Approaching it more slowly by walking up the chord means it doesn't really feel like an apex anymore, and weakening that initial high point makes the rest of the downward slide less impactful. But if it's gonna be a downward slide, then the second bar feels weird. It's just sitting on F the whole time, killing all the momentum. This seems like a huge wasted opportunity, so let's fix it with a real walk down the scale. Okay, I'm gonna be honest, that sucks. It feels robotic, with none of the beautiful poignance of the real riff. F is the second note in the key, and especially in minor, the second has a really hollow sound. It's right above the root, so it wants to step down, but it's also a half step below the third, so there's another possible resolution that's closer but less final. It's being pulled in both directions, leaving it feeling stuck in the middle, clearly unstable, but kind of unsure what to do about it. It's a haunting sound, and spending a whole bar not just hanging on it, but hammering it repeatedly in slow, insistent quarter notes, drives home the anxiety of the song's story. He's still walking down the scale, but he's making a pit stop in the most unsettling place along the way. F winds up being a pretty important note throughout the song, and in this riff, Shinoda makes absolutely sure you're paying attention to it. That's all the ways I can think of to ruin the riff, so let's move on. The main thing I want to look at in this video is soundcraft. In the end, like many Linkin Park songs, it's an extremely dense track with so many different layers contributing to the overall atmosphere. Or, I mean, not right away. The intro is pretty sparse. Behind Shinoda's piano, there's a subtle string part playing a simple bass line, and on top of it, there's this glitchy rhythm track from turntablist Joe Hahn, introducing a distorted technological element that contrasts the gentle ambient tone of the piano, adding a layer of digital ugliness that foreshadows the rest of the track. But that's pretty much it. The focus here is squarely on that big, empty piano line. But when the verse comes in, it's a different story. Let's start with Brad Delman's bass. This is the only part that really implies a chord progression, and interestingly, it's the same loop we saw in my last analysis video on In the Air Tonight, starting on the minor root, walking down the scale to the flat 6th, then walking back up. I called it the pacing tiger loop because it has this strong sense of anxiety and tension that never really gets released, and I think that applies here as well. But this isn't really a song about a chord progression. Listening to the full track, the register of that 5-string bass is so low that I barely hear the notes changing. What does stand out to me, though, is the rhythm. There's this flurry of 16th notes on the first beat, then a long pause, then another flurry at the end. But looking at the bass on its own is only seeing half the picture. To really understand this part, we have to combine it with its natural partner in crime, the kick drum. And here we see an interesting pattern. Drummer Rob Burden joins in with the 16th notes at the start of the bar, but leaves Delman out to dry on the back half. Instead, he has this loping sort of fill where a single kick cascades into a snare, then an open hi-hat, and then finally the next downbeat, where he picks up the 16th note rhythm again. Both parts in concert seem perfectly designed to achieve one singular goal: hit the downbeat really hard. You can almost hear that rhythmic accent smearing out across the entire first beat as the two parts come together to drive home the start of the bar before splitting off to do their own things in the back half. That metric clarity helps ground Shinoda's vocals, which can get pretty elaborate in their rhythm, but we'll get to those in a bit. First, we've got more layers to cover. Like Delman's bassline is doubled by a cello, which I don't have a lot to say about on its own, but along with everything else we've heard so far, that's a lot of low end, isn't it? With one glaring exception that we'll see in a minute, all the instruments in this section are really low. Even the drums are mixed pretty bass heavy. This gives the track a deep rumbling quality, like an earthquake going off underneath Shinoda, and it stands in sharp contrast to the intro. Listening to the transition, you can really hear the weight of that sudden eruption of bass. But you may have also heard something else, the guitar line, also played by Delman. He's using guitar harmonics, which is a technique where instead of pressing down on a fret, you gently rest your finger on the string, muting most of its natural vibrating frequencies and leaving you with this beautiful, pristine, super high tone. This line cuts through all the bass beneath it, balancing the mix nicely without getting in the way of the rumble. But it also brings its own kind of roughness. These three harmonics are played on the top three strings, and he doesn't bother muting one before playing the next, so they all ring together. Which, sure, fine, but the first two are a half step apart. This mirrors the relationship between G-flat and F in the piano riff, but now they're bleeding into each other. In fact, this line uses exactly the same 4 pitches the piano did, and again it places a strong emphasis on F to create a sense of desolation. It's so separated in register from the rest of the track that it doesn't really interact with anything else, but these 2 notes, all alone in the extreme upper register, are having their own little dissonant battle, adding a hard-to-pinpoint level of discomfort to the atmosphere. Remember this part, by the way, it'll come up again later. That's the first half of the verse, and the headline is there's nothing going on in the middle register. Everyone's staying well out of Shinoda's way. But halfway through, the energy starts to build with the addition of 2 new parts, each filling in a bit of that missing range. First, there's some higher strings that harmonize the bass line into a power chord. These add a little warmth to the track, bridging the timbral gap between the low and high ends without getting in the way. Much more prominent, though, is the return of the piano riff. We already talked about this on its own, but here it takes on a new role as just one piece of a much larger puzzle. It brings the same somber sense of poignance and despair, but now its slow, deliberate rhythm is contrasted by Burton's frenetic kicks and Shinoda's dense syncopation, and its hanging F alternates in time with Delman's harmonic line. It's a really nice touch that ties the rest of the song back to the intro, capitalizing on its emotional clarity to tell a more complex story. On top of all that sits Shinoda's rap verse, so with everything else out of the way, let's do some flow analysis. He's doing a lot here, but I want to focus on how he uses rhyme. The verse is split into 4 4-bar stanzas, each punctuated by a brief double from Bennington.
All I know.
The first stanza begins with a simple couplet.
One thing, I don't know why, it doesn't even matter how hard you try.
There's some small internal stuff if you look closely, but it's mostly just the end rhyme. He's starting off nice and easy. From there, though, he flips it around, taking that I rhyme and throwing it all over the place.
Keep that in mind, I designed this rhyme to explain in due time.
Juxtaposing against the simple scheme of the first half and opening up much more advanced options for the lines to come. In the second stanza, he again starts with a couplet, but this time he's using multiple syllables, rhyming
valuable thing
with
pendulum swings.
Bit of a slant rhyme, sure, but clearly there. And he keeps it going, taking the first 3 of those 4 syllables and using them to start the end of his next line,
End of the day,
tying them together while still evolving the scheme. This stanza also features some more prominent internal rhymes, with the second and third lines containing their own accented rhyming pairs. The first one continues the I sound from the previous stanza,
watch it fly by,
while the second switches off that to a new sound.
Watch it count down.
The third stanza sticks with a consistent end rhyme throughout, rhyming
Low, do, no,
and
go.
But of course it's not that simple. In the first line, he continues that internal ow sound with an accented
Didn't look out.
Then in the second, he sneaks an extra
Watch the time go
to emphasize the new primary rhyme. And in the third and fourth lines, he adds an extra mid-rhyme across the 2 phrases, rhyming
trying to hold on
in the middle of the first with
wasted it all
in the second. This turns them from a couplet into a sort of quatrain with 4 shorter interwoven phrases. This stanza also marks a significant shift in Bennington's vocal accompaniment. So far, he's been singing quiet and low.
It's so unreal.
But here he jumps up, starts belting, and holds the last note through the entire 4th stanza. It's also the first time his interjections are incorporated into the rhyme scheme. Up to now, they've been unconnected syllabic islands, but when he sings,
Watch you go,
it's a clear structural conclusion to Shinoda's flow throughout the phrase. And finally, the 4th stanza is sort of one long couplet, rhyming
part
with
hard.
But they're so far apart that it's easy to miss this main rhyme entirely. The emphasis here is much more on the internal stuff. For the first line, he brings back that I syllable,
kept everything inside, and even though I tried,
before suddenly abandoning that initial sound with the line,
it all fell apart,
which is poetically really cool. The rhyme itself, the one we started the verse with, falls apart to represent the greater collapse he's rapping about. From there, he launches into one last flurry of rhymes based on a brand new syllable.
What it meant to me will eventually be a memory.
Before leading into the chorus. But I've fallen into a bit of a music theory trap. I've described what's happening, but description isn't analysis, so let's analyze. Why does he do it like this? Fortunately, I think the answer is pretty easy. He keeps changing his flow because otherwise it'd get stale. Without a clear melody, poetry becomes a lot more important. Repeating the same pattern over and over gets predictable, so he mixes things up to keep you guessing. It also adds rhythmic interest. The rhyming syllables fall all over the bar, creating an erratic sort of syncopation that changes shape with each phrase. And this is all pretty common in 90s era hip-hop. I don't want to imply that Shinoda invented this technique or anything, but I do want to highlight just how thoughtful he was in crafting this verse, because if you're not familiar with this sort of lyricism, it's easy to miss the forest for the trees. A lot of people don't really think of lyrics as part of the music, but verses like this make it clear how difficult it can be to try to fully separate them. Coming back to the soundscape, the chorus takes things in a pretty different direction. While the verses left a lot of space around Shinoda, once Bennington takes the lead, everything comes crashing in around him. And nowhere is that sudden filling of space more apparent than in Burden's drums. In the verse, he was playing heavy kicks with quiet hi-hats, but in the chorus, he moves over to the ride cymbal, and that louder, splashier sound makes a much larger statement in the mix. These higher-end cymbals give the drums a brighter, punchier, more energetic sound, filling in more of the frequency spectrum that the verse neglected. There's also a new snare hit on the 16th note before beat 3, which is probably meant to marry with a new bass rhythm that includes the same accent. Here, Delman trades the rapid-fire blasts for some syncopation, so it feels a little more settled and less lopsided, while still maintaining a heavy sort of groove. The bass and strings both carry through from the verse, and they're joined by a distorted guitar playing power chords. This makes the chord progression much more prominent than it was in the verse, except that's not the same chord progression. We're starting in the same place with an E-flat chord, but instead of just walking up and down the scale, it jumps to G-flat, falls to D-flat, then steps down to C-flat. On its own, this is a bit of a weird chord loop. Chords a third apart tend to sound weak and directionless, and while E-flat is supposed to be our root, it's surrounded by thirds. Which is perfect at the beginning. If E-flat is the landing point, then you want the G-flat to feel like a departure, not another resolution. But conversely, you don't want the E-flat itself to feel like a departure, which is exactly what would happen if you approached it directly from C-flat. So they don't. On the last beat, the C-flat chord steps away to something a little better suited for that final resolution. The first time through, it jumps down to a low D-flat in order to scoop back up to the root, and the second time it slides down to B-flat, setting up a big 5-1 resolution in order to reset for the next verse. And there's one last line that really ties this chorus together. Remember that part Delman was playing in the verse with the guitar harmonics? Yeah, he doesn't stop. I said that the beauty of harmonics is their pure, clean tone, and that's true, but here we see what happens when you take that crystal clear sound and run it through some pretty nasty distortion. On the first note, it still sounds fine, but as soon as he hits that half step together, the heavy distortion makes the dissonance like 1,000 times worse. All the competing frequencies give those harmonics a brutal, industrial-sounding edge, painting a sonic picture of massive, all-encompassing machinery that speaks to many of the technological anxieties of the year 2000. I actually really like the journey this part goes through. It's the main melodic accompaniment at the start of the verse, but then the piano comes back and kinda drowns it out. When the chorus hits, things get even louder and the piano drops out again, but the harmonics are still there, harsher and louder than ever. He completely ignores the changing chords, which is fine because this part didn't make much sense over the verse chords either. It's its own thing, more a noise than a melody, shaping the contour of the upper register with weird dissonances and haunting tones that aren't meant to blend with anything else. And in the middle of all this noise sits Bennington.
I've tried so hard and got so far, but in the end, it doesn't even matter.
His melody's pretty straightforward, leaning once again on that unstable F before winding his way back to E flat to end the phrase. But for the sake of contrast, I also want to look at how he uses rhyme. The chorus doesn't have that many lyrics, but the ones it does have borrow a trick from Shinoda's fourth stanza, starting a simple rhyme, then suddenly dropping it when he gets to a line about failure. It's still a cute trick, but it's delivered in a much more formulaic way, which isn't a bad thing. Part of the point is to contrast the dense lyricism of Shinoda's part with something that lends itself more to a straightforward melody. This is the hook, after all. It's good that it can so easily worm its way into your head. And if it's gonna be simple anyway, building it off one of Shinoda's tricks instead of just going for a standard couplet ties the two vocalists together in a really neat way. This leads into the second verse, which is almost identical to the first. The only difference I could find in the arrangement is that the bass holds the note on beat 2 instead of playing it staccato. Shinoda's first and fourth stanzas are basically repeats from the first verse, and while the middle stanzas are different, they're using similar enough ideas that you probably don't need me to spell out the details. And the second chorus is, again, pretty similar to the first, which leaves us with one last section: the bridge. Here, I'm actually going to start with Bennington because this melody
I've put my trust in you
is in G flat major. It starts on the fifth, clearly emphasizes all three notes of the one chord, and ends with a strong repeated resolution to the root.
One thing you should know.
He's even leaning on A flat, the second note of that key, just like the rest of the song leaned on F. Unaccompanied like this, it's extremely clear that this melody belongs in G flat major. But it's not unaccompanied. Underneath him is a beefed up version of the intro. The piano's back, doing the same thing it always does. In addition to the glitch track, Burden plays a sparse drum beat, and instead of a cello playing the bass line, Delman plays an actual bass, laying out the verse progression, but in a higher octave to lighten up the overall soundscape. It's a pretty quiet section, at least relatively speaking, but importantly, both the piano and the bass are still pretty clearly in E flat. There's no evidence that either one of them noticed Bennington's key change. So, did he really change keys at all? Can't we just say it's a minor melody that happens to emphasize the third and seventh? I mean, yeah, we absolutely can. That's a perfectly reasonable analysis, but personally, I still like to call it major because it helps explain what he does in the second half. This part jumps up in register,
I've put my trust in you.
And while in the first half he literally never sang E flat, now it's the central note. And the contour of the melody is very similar, even ending with an identical repeated resolution to that root.
One thing you should know.
So while none of the notes in this section put him definitively outside the original key, I still think it makes more sense to view this as an excursion to major that eventually returns home to minor. It does a better job capturing the emotional arc of the section. It's a cliche to say that major is happy and minor is sad, and I don't think either of those really apply here, but different tonalities still have different emotional characteristics. In this case, I'd say the major section sounds resigned, defeated, especially with the minor accompaniment holding it back. The minor follow-up, on the other hand, mostly sounds angry. Of course, those emotions were already pretty obvious from his vocal tone. Compare this
I've put my trust in you
to this.
I've put my trust in you.
But still, I don't think this would work half as well if all he did was start screaming. The changing melodic tonality, the changing vocal timbre, the changing register, and of course the changing orchestration that I didn't even talk about all contribute to the impact of these two halves. But seriously, underneath the lyrics, they're completely different sections. The first half is a play on the intro, while the second is basically the chorus again, borrowing that section's chord progression and most of its instrumentation. The only prominent part missing is that distorted guitar harmonic line, which they hold off until the start of the final chorus, to make sure there's a little juice left in the tank for that final climactic transition. And that's pretty much it. After the chorus, the piano comes back one more time, slows down, and ends with an arpeggio of an E-flat minor triad with an added ninth, leaving us hanging on F one final time. It's a reminder of the unresolved angst that runs throughout the song, emphasizing that the band isn't really presenting answers, only pointing out problems. And for a lot of teenagers in the early 2000s, that was the appeal. So many things were going wrong in the world, and we could see them, but it didn't feel like we could do anything to stop them. Songs like this were a way of reassuring ourselves that even if we didn't have the power to change them yet, we weren't imagining things. It's hard to call a song built on the idea that nothing you do matters hopeful, but in a way, that's exactly what it was. It was a hope that someone else saw the problem too, even if they couldn't fix it either. It was a hope that you weren't alone, that someone was listening, and that they understood. It's a small thing to want, but around that time it was a hard thing to find, and songs like this were an important outlet for kids who just wanted the world to be better when it seemed to keep getting worse. Anyway, thanks for watching. If you want to help support the channel, the best way to do that is to join our Patreon. In addition to just making these videos possible, every month my patrons get to vote on which song I analyze, and this time they surprised me by picking out this really nostalgic classic for me. This is the stuff I grew up with. It was a really fun song to break down. I'd especially like to thank Susan Jones, Jill Sungard, Howard Levine, Warren Hewart, Damian Fuller-Sutherland, John Hancock, and Jeff for their extremely generous support. That goes a long way toward keeping this channel going, but really anyone who supports me at any level on Patreon, thank you. You're all amazing, and I really appreciate it. Beyond that, I guess all I have left to say is, don't forget to like, share, comment, subscribe, and above all, keep on rockin'.